Estamos grabando la clase de la UDLA Grammar 2 del día lunes 15 de noviembre con el último contenido a evaluar en el ejercicio 2, el cual es Non-Finite Clauses. Denme un segundo que me enredé en los cables. Ya. Non-finite clauses. Okay, so today we're going to begin with this and we're going to evaluate it on the second exercise we're going to have on Monday, 29th of November, okay? Okay, so in order to begin with this discussion, we have to talk a little bit about the idea of tense, okay? To begin with, every single clause in English, we just say English, but in every single language, but not in every single language, but in English mostly, and in Spanish as well. But within the English clause, we have one particular element, which is the verb phrase. And inside of the verb phrase, we have some aspects or some variations. You can create different forms of verb phrases by producing certain changes. One of these changes is the tense. Tense is the grammatical representation of time. Okay, so with this, we have to state a difference, okay? Okay, so we have the idea of tense. Tense is the grammatical representation of time, grammatical representation of time, the grammatical representation of time, right? This, which means tense is something we're going to add to our language in order to represent time, okay? So far, we know that within the English verbs, we can add some further morphemes. Therefore, we can create inflectional verbs, right? We can inflect those verbs. Inflection means we're going to add another morpheme, but that morpheme is adding grammatical meaning, but not changing the word category. Therefore, the verb play can be inflected by the presence of, for example, Z2, creating then the form plays, right? Which means that the verb is referring to the present tense, right? In the same, following the same idea, I can also state that the form play can be inflected by the bound morpheme ed1, therefore creating the form played, right? Which is used to represent the idea of past, right? Right. So,
Profe,
dígame.
al lado de play, después de decir plays, es como el presente, abajo dice play. ¿Qué es lo que está entre medio de los slash?
ED1.
ED1. ¿Y eso
¿Sí?
qué significa, profe?
Que le colocamos el morfema ed a la forma play y el resultado es played, lo que significa que representa una idea de pasado, ¿cierto?
Ya.
Ya, eso es súper importante, ¿sí? Therefore, the English verb can be inflected so as to represent present and past, right? Therefore, and as a consequence of this, the English language allows us to represent present and past tense, right? Present and past tense. Okay? Okay. So this is really, really important. I can say I play. If I say I play, I know this is present, right? If I say I played, I know this is past. But how can I know that? I know that because of the presence of this ED1 morpheme, right? The ED1 morpheme. As a summary, I can state the difference between present and past by the presence of these marks, right? I'm marking the verb so as to represent present or past. With the difference between present and past is sort of obvious because we're going to add ed1 to every single one of those verbs. I played, you played, he played, and I won't change it, right? I won't make any change, not taking into consideration, for example, a person, first, second, or third person. I played, you played, he played, or number, plural or singular. I played, we played. It's always the same, so it's quite simple. In present is sort of more difficult because we're going to add the Z2, but just to the third person singular, right? So I will say, he plays, but I will say I play, right? So the S is the marked form, even though play in the second part with the first person singular is also in present, right? Right. Okay.
Profe,
Dígame.
eso era una Z, Z1, Z2.
Z1 es plural, la S cuando marca plural. Z2 es la S cuando marca tercera persona singular en presente simple.
Ya, profe, gracias.
Okay. Tense. Then, in grammar, the form of a verb that shows the time at which an action happened, for example, I sing, is the present tense and I sang is the past tense. The very same thing I was saying. In the example of I sing, right? In this example, I sing. In this example, I sing. I know this is present because of the form of the verb. And in the second example, I sang. I know that sung is in past because of the ed1, which is contained inside of that verb, right? Therefore, tense, this is a definition I took out of the Cambridge Line Dictionary, okay? So tense as a noun is a verb-based method used to indicate the time and sometimes the continuation or completeness of an action or a state in relation to the time of speaking. Okay, I'm going to translate this into normal language, right? Tense then is a method used to indicate the time, right? And sometimes I don't agree that much with this idea, continuation or completeness. I don't agree that because that's another thing. It's called aspect, okay? Of an action or a state. When I say action or a state, I'm talking about a verb, right? At the time of speaking. The concept of tense in English is a method that we use to refer to time, past, present, and future, okay? Many languages use tense to talk about time. Other languages have no concept of tense at all, but of course they can still talk about time using different methods. I need you to understand this. Even though I can talk and I can write in different ways, right? In the English language, we know the rules, right? Subject, verb, object, and all that. I can write some stuff, but then when I want to mean that something happened in the past, I need to mark that inside of that sentence, right? And the way in which we're going to do it is by using this idea of tense, which is the fact that we're going to add some signal, some forms. In this case, in our case, these bound morphemes, we're going to add those to the verb, and because of that, we'll know that we're talking about present or past. The problem with the English language is that I have, or we have, or the English language has morphemes to state present, set to, and past simple, past, ed1, but we don't have that for future, right? Let's take this as an example. In Spanish, I can say yo juego present, yo jugué past, yo jugaré future, right? Therefore, I can say that within the English language, you can mark, you can add these symbols to the verb, you can add these bound morphemes to the verb so as to represent the idea of time. In which times? Well, in different times. In these three different examples, you have present, past, and future, right? Meanwhile, in English, I can say I play, and I know this is present. The same as if I say he plays, I know this is present. Jugué con U. Muchas gracias. Gracias, Catalina. Una U entre medio. Ahí está. Thank you. De nuevo, in English, you can state present, I play, or he plays, but you can also state I played. Past. But how can I do, or what can I do so as to represent future? Can I put another morpheme to a verb so as to represent future?
No, no se puede.
No. Right? Therefore, within the English language, you have just two different tenses, present and past, just two, right? So how can I state future meaning, right? Future reference. I will do it by using an auxiliary verb. In this case is the auxiliary verb will, right? Right. Summary. Within the English language, you can refer to different times, right? And we are going to refer to those different times by marking verbs, right? The English language allows us to mark for present, set to, and for past, ed1. And when you want to state something in the future, you need a periphrastic construction. That is to say, you need the presence of another totally different word, right? And the mixture and the combination of words will let you know that something is happening in that time, right? One thing. Second, and very, very important thing, tense is a grammatical feature. That is to say, is a matter of the system of the how can I say that, of the programming language of English, right? But in real and concrete terms, it is not related to meaning. Okay, sort of. ¿Se entiende la diferencia entre tense y time? Eso es pregunta de ejercicio, seguro, seguro.
Profe, a ver, por lo que yo entendí, el tense es como la terminación del verbo, el cual se divide en categorías como la ED1 o la Z1 o Z2,
Solo Z2,
depende.
Z1 es plural.
Ya, o sea, solo Z2.
Solo Z2.
Ya.
¿Ya?
Y la otra es como por el tiempo.
Time, claro.
Sí, ya, listo.
Time es una referencia a un tiempo. Definitiva, es lo que yo entiendo, ¿sí? Y tense es solo gramatical, es solo cómo se escribe y la capacidad del verbo de hacer referencia al tiempo, pero no es el tiempo. Es enredado, lo sé, por eso me detengo y quiero que comprendan este punto antes de avanzar. El resto lo entiende, ¿no?
Sí, porque al final el tiempo se va conjugando con los otros auxiliares, se va identificando mejor. En este caso, el
Claro,
tense,
pero Rodrigo, nuevamente, el tiempo es algo que tú comprendes. El tense es la herramienta lingüística del lenguaje para marcar el tiempo.
ya. O sea, para identificar finalmente que ocupamos el tense. Para,
Exacto.
perfecto.
Okay. Tense. So we talk about time in English with tense, but this is a very but there is a very big but about this whole idea. So, in other words, yes, the English language makes reference to time by using the tense, but there's a big but, right? There are lots of very important things that we must know in order to understand this, right? It's not that simple. First, we can also talk about time without using tense. For example, going to is a special construction to talk about the future, and it's not a tense. And that's what we were saying, right? In this last example, as you can see, I will play the verb play. It is not marked for tense, right? But how can I know this is a future tense? I know because of the presence of the auxiliary verb will, right? Right. So every single time, every time I have an auxiliary verb, or in more precise, to be more precise, every single time that I have a modal verb, I will have tense, right? Modal verbs. Modal verbs like will, might, may, can, could, shall, would, must, have to, ought to. Okay. So every single time that I have one of those modal verbs, I will have tense. That's important. And the other part is this. One tense does not always talk about one time. For example, we can use the present tense or even the past tense to talk about the future, right? So I have these ideas. In terms of time, different forms can be used to express the same meaning. So, for example, goalkeeper goes into the hospital tomorrow. The goalkeeper goes into the hospital tomorrow. You can see how this goalkeeper goes into the hospital tomorrow. You can see goes is a verb phrase, right? It's acting as the verb. And this verb phrase, as you can see, it has a verb with a Z2, right? Which means present simple, right? But the question is this sentence about the present or about the future? Goalkeeper goes into the hospital tomorrow. this sentence is about the future. And this is a very important, a very, very, very important point. Why? Because with this, I state the difference, and I'm telling you, they are not the same. Tense and time, they are not the same, right? Tense is a grammatical distinction which is used to represent time, but I can use different forms to represent the same time, right? Like in this example, where the present simple is used to represent the future time. This is a special rule, okay? So please remember this. When you are really, really, really sure that something is going to happen, or when something is being scheduled, like for example, our test, you can say, or you can refer to the future time by using present simple. Another example, for example, if I know that a plane or a train is coming at the very same time every single day, I can say that the train arrives at 7 o'clock tomorrow. Okay, so that's an exception for the present simple. Let's take a look at the second example. This part of the project will go ahead. That's future time. This part of the project will go ahead. Yes, it's future time because it's referring to something that's going to happen later on with modal will. Yeah, and I know this modal will go on, will go, right? Will go, even though you don't have tense because you don't have a modifier, you don't have a morpheme inside of the main verb go, you don't have that, therefore you don't have tense. But by the presence of the modal verb will, you mark that the verb is happening in the future, right? All over again, tense and time, they are not the same. Tense is the grammatical representation of time, and you can represent time in different ways. That's all. In English, finite verbs can be marked with only two tenses, present and past. Okay. Therefore, as we already discussed, verbs in English can take tense, right? Verbs in English, they can take tense. Therefore, because of the idea of tense, if the verb have tense, then we're going to call it tensed verb, right? Is a tensed verb phrase. But some other people call them finite verb phrase, right? Finite because as it states a reference to time, we know when this thing is happening. And for example, if I read, he plays, I know that this thing is happening, that action is taking place at the moment of speaking, right? Therefore, it's in present, right? Because of that, and because of the presence of this Z2, I will say that plays is a finite verb phrase. The same with played. I played. I know that the clause is stating a reference to the past, right? Something that has already happened. And as it is marked by the presence of the ED1, I will say that this verb phrase is tensed, therefore is a finite verb phrase, right? On the other hand, you can have verb phrases with no reference to time, and they are called tenseless verb phrases, and we're going to call them non-finite verb phrases. Non-finite verb phrases, right? So you have the tensed finite verb phrases and the tenseless non-finite verb phrases. In English, finite verbs, okay, finite verbs, that is to say the ones that can represent tense, can be marked with only two tenses, okay? Present and past. I already explained that. When I say present, I'm talking about Z2, and when I say past, I'm talking about ED, ED1. If they can't be represented by any of these two different morphemes, you can also say modal verb. When there is a modal verb, that verb phrase is finite as well. Verb phrases marked for tense are called tensed verb phrases or finite verb phrases. Or finite verb phrases. A tensed verb phrase. Finite verb phrases can be marked only for two tenses, present and past. We know that. Other main verb phrases may include a modal verb. We know that. However, these two options can't occur together. A finite verb phrase either has a modal or is marked for tense, but not for both. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that. Okay, I'm going to state this difference. Okay, so we're saying a verb phrase, which is the same as finite, can be marked for present or can be marked for past. If I say present, the example would be quite easily, he plays. And if I say past, the example would be, he played, right? Right. Now, they also say that you have a third version of this, and the third version will be the presence of a modal verb, right? So my example will be, he will play, right? Right. Then they say that they are in, you can change them. I mean, you can combine them. You can't have a modal verb and have a tensed verb phrase. I mean, that is to say, the verb phrase is tense with either the presence of a modal verb or one of these morphemes. So if I do this, is possible? Is this example possible?
No.
No,
No,
it
porque
is not
está
possible.
futuro.
Porque está will, ¿cierto?
Sí,
Porque como está el modal verb, ahí ya está el tense. En esa presencia está el tense. Por eso esto ya no es necesario. Y esa es la explicación gramatical real al por qué se dice que siempre es will más bare infinitive. ¿Han cachado que cuando les dicen cómo se hace el verbo will? No, se hace el verbo will con el verbo will más el bare infinitive de un verbo. O base form, le dicen también. Lo que no te explicaron en ese momento era que si está will, la presencia del tense ya está puesta. Por lo tanto, no es necesario colocar una S o un ED o nada atrás.
es lo mismo que ocurre con el did.
Exactamente igual, porque ¿dónde sé yo que está en pasado? Mira, hagámosla. Ahí está mi verb phrase. ¿Dónde sé yo que está en pasado? ¿O qué me
Con
marca el pasado?
el did.
Este. Por eso ya no necesito colocar plate acá atrás.
Claro.
¿Cachai? Ejemplo. I am playing. ¿Cuándo ocurre esa acción? ¿Presente, pasado, futuro?
Presente.
Presente. ¿Dónde dice que está en presente esa cosa?
En el am.
Exacto. Ahí está el tense. ¿Se entiende, no? La misma, pues I
Pero ahí
was,
en ese caso igual está agregando algo al verbo, po, el ing, o no tiene que ver con lo otro.
pero
¿No
eso
es lo
marca
mismo?
otra cosa. El ing te dice que la acción todavía no termina.
No es un tense,
No,
como
se
el
llama
id o el
aspecto.
es. Mm, es distinto.
Es distinto. Mírala de abajo, es la misma, pero ahora ya no está en presente, ahora está en pasado. ¿Cómo sé yo que está en pasado?
Pero el was,
Exacto. ¿Y la acción termina o no termina?
no,
No, pues, ¿cómo sé eso? Por el ing.
el ing. Sí.
¿Se entiende, no? Espero que sí.
Por eso será el continuous, profe. Present continuous o past
Ya,
continuous.
ahí venía, ahí venía. ¿Cómo se llama la I am playing? ¿Cómo se llama ese tiempo, comillas?
¿Cómo, profe?
I am playing. A la gente se lo enseñan como los tiempos verbales. ¿Cómo se llama el tiempo I'm playing?
Es presente continuo. Present continuous.
¿Y el de abajo cómo se llama? Was playing.
No me interesa.
Ese es un past continuous, ¿cierto? Pero en verdad no se llaman así, se llaman asá. Ese es el nombre de verdad. Present tense continuous aspect. Lo de aspect no lo vamos a tocar, solo les digo que existe. Se llama continuous aspect cuando aparece el ing. Pero el past tense es lo que nos importa. ¿Cómo sé que es past tense? Because of the presence of the auxiliary verb was. ¿Se entiende, no, chiquillo?
Profe, va un poquito rápido, no alcanzó ni a escribir.
Por eso les pregunto. ¿Dónde quedaron? Yo me devuelvo, no tengo nada.
Por ejemplo, yo lo estoy siguiendo, pero en eso del I am playing, no sé por qué sacó ese ejemplo, sino no sé qué tiene que ver con la
Habl-
materia.
Hablábamos de
Me
esto.
perdí.
Hablábamos que tense, como la representación gramatical del tiempo, pero no es tiempo, no significa tiempo. Cuando un verbo tiene tense, se le llama finite. Y como el inglés solo me permite escribir o añadir información del presente y el pasado, por eso están ese ejemplo y ese ejemplo. La tercera forma que tiene de añadir información es con la aparición de un verbo modal. Por eso está ese ejemplo. Pero si aparece un modal, el verbo que lo sigue ya no puede escribirse con el tense, present o past. ¿Cachai? Ejemplo mal hecho, este de acá. He will place está mal hecho. ¿Por qué está mal hecho? Porque debido a la presencia del modal will, ya no es posible colocar el tense que está aquí, ¿cierto? Por eso está malo. ¿Sí? Sí. Entonces, hay tres formas de marcar tense en inglés. Present tense, Z2, past tense, E de 1 y con la presencia de un verbo modal. ¿Cachai? Con eso expliqué eso y eso. Luego dijimos estábamos con Rodrigo hablando y era que, por ejemplo, si yo digo he didn't play, lo voy a hacer de nuevo. ¿cierto? Es un negativo de un pasado simple. Pero ¿dónde rayos, cómo sé yo que esta cosa está en pasado? Por la presencia del auxiliar en pasado. ¿Cachai? Didn't. Entonces, ¿dónde está marcado el tense? En didn't. ¿Sí? Debido a eso, saltamos a este otro ejemplo. I am playing. I'm playing es el verbo, la verb phrase. Pero, ¿y cómo se llama esa cosa? Presente continuo. Pero ¿cómo sé yo que está en presente? Por la presencia del auxiliar am, que es el que está en presente. Entonces, el que dice que está en presente, cuando aparecen auxiliares, es el auxiliar, no el main verb. El main verb entrega otra información. Como en este caso, la ing nos dice que es continuous, que aún no termina la acción de ocurrir. Luego le preguntaba a la compañera cuál es la diferencia entre am playing y was playing, en que am es presente y was es pasado. Y si te fijas ahí, playing se escribe igual. Entonces es presente continuo, pasado continuo. ¿Cachai? Entonces el tense está en el auxiliar acá adelante. Y una forma, la más fácil para pillar cuando algo tiene tense es si puedes nombrar el tiempo verbal que nosotros le decimos. Entonces, como se llama present continuous, en verdad ese no es el nombre, esa es una reducción del nombre. El nombre de verdad es present tense continuous aspect. El aspecto es otra de las características de los verbos que no vamos a discutir ahora porque podríamos estar años en eso. Pero lo importante es la idea de tense. Si tú puedes ver una verb phrase y saber en qué tiempo está, es tense, 100%. Es finite verb phrase, 100%.
Profe, pero aquí me surgió una duda.
Dígame.
Cuando es modal y dice we will play, ¿cierto?
Ujú.
Pero eso es futuro, po, pero el
Sí.
futuro no es un tense.
Claro, po. No es un tense. Muy bien.
Entonces,
Porque el tense es una representación gramatical del tiempo. ¿Cachai? El inglés permite que exista una forma en la que yo modifique un verbo para hablar del tiempo. Y esa modificación se llama tense. ¿Cachai? El
sí,
punto...
Entonces, finalmente, así como por lo que me dijo la Catalina, si tú al reconocer un tiempo en como en la oración, en las sentences, es tense, sería solamente si tú puedes mirar si están los auxiliares como el will, el didn't, no si el verbo está con ed o con la s.
Ya, yo veo is it raining. Eso es finite o non-finite. O sea, ¿tiene tense o no tiene tense? Is it raining?
Yo digo que no.
Si tiene, po.
sí tiene por el it, o
Por
sea,
el
por el
is.
is.
Ahí está el tense, en el is. ¿Cachai? Ya, esa es la versión difícil porque ahí tú tienes que reconocer, uno, cuál es el verbo auxiliar, dos, cuál es el morpheme que se le pegó. Esa es la versión difícil. Esta es la versión fácil. Is it raining? ¿En qué tiempo está escrito eso?
Present.
Presente continuo, ¿cierto?
Sí.
Ya, pues entonces es finite, porque es presente continuo. Present tense continuous aspect. ¿Cachai?
Y ahí como que me genera una duda.
Ujú.
El is, ¿cómo yo lo podría identificar? O sea, porque me perdí.
Ah, mira, porque déjame, estoy peleando con el compu, tranquilo. Ya. Present continuous, también le llaman progressive. ¿Cómo se arma? ¿Cierto? Así. Entonces, I am playing. ¿Sí? Eso es present continuous. Eso es el affirmative, ¿no? I am not playing. Negative. Interrogative. Entonces lo que se giró, ay, puso más, qué tonto. Ay, ¿cachai? Que en las preguntas lo que mueves adelante del sujeto es el auxiliar, el primer auxiliar.
Ah, ya entendí. Ya. Ahora sí.
¿Cachai? Y en el análisis es raro porque queda abierto. Queda, como era esta cuestión, era así. Entonces, is it raining? Es un present continuous. Y como digo present continuous, present tense continuous. El presente es finite verb phrase. La segunda, I spoke to Joanne last night. ¿Esa es finite o non-finite? ¿Tiene tense o no tiene tense?
Si tiene tense,
Si tiene tense. ¿Cuál tense tiene? Present or past?
past.
Past tense. ¿Cómo lo sé? Porque se llama past simple. Past tense simple. Ah, bueno, estamos. We didn't get any food because we didn't have enough time. Didn't get. Ahí tengo mi primera verb. Tengo dos verb phrases porque tengo una dependent clause, ¿no? Y aquí está la dependent. Y ahí está la verb phrase de la dependent. La primero, la uno, esta. ¿Es finite o non-finite?
Finite.
Finite. ¿Y cuál tense es? Present or past?
Past.
Past, ¿cierto? Porque está en past simple, past tense simple. Y la dos, didn't have.
Igual.
Is finite and with past tense.
Finite past. Sí.
Sí, buena, esa. Solo les quiero mostrar una non-finite. Ya, aquí está el ejercicio, se lo muestro al tiro, I had something to eat before leaving. Análisis sintáctico. I had something. Ese to eat before leaving. Esa es una cláusula. Ahí hay una verb phrase. Aquí hay una prepositional phrase. Y aquí hay el complemento. Uno, had. Finite o non-finite. ¿Tiene tense o no tiene tense?
Sí, past tense.
Maravilloso. Dos, to eat. También es una verb phrase. ¿Tiene tense o no tiene tense?
Creo que no.
No, po. Porque ¿en qué tiempo está esa cosa? Léala sola. To eat before leaving. ¿Cuándo pasó eso? Present, past. No sabemos. Entonces esa es una
No.
non-finite.
Como cuando está el verbo en base, es como non-finite.
Y ahí puede pasar aquí también, mira. Con ing solo. También puede ocurrir. Pero no me quiero adelantar, pero de eso es lo que vamos a hablar. Eso es lo que estamos hablando. Para allá vamos, ¿cachai? Volvamos atrás. No nos adelantemos tanto. Ya. Sí, ya la vimos. Future. Ya, entonces, if the English language has this or allows us to represent present and allows us to represent past, how can we represent future? There is no way to mark future tense on verbs in English, right? Because you don't have that morpheme. Verbs cannot be inflected for future tense. We know that. Future time is usually marked in the verb phrase with a modal or semi-modal verb, right? Therefore, the presence of a modal verb will mark the verb phrase so as to represent future time. I already discussed this. Finite clauses must contain a verb which shows tense. They can be main clauses or subordinate clauses. Okay. Okay. So if the verb phrase inside of a clause has tense, then we will say it is a finite clause. If the verb phrase inside of a clause does not represent tense, we're going to say it is a non-finite clause, right? Therefore, and as we already stated, those three different examples are finite clauses. Why? Because every single one of those verb phrases, they have tense, right? They are finite clauses. Meanwhile, non-finite clauses contain a verb which does not show tense. We usually use non-finite verbs only in subordinate clauses. We usually understand the time referred to from the context of the main clause. We often use a non-finite clause when the subject is the same as the subject in the main clause. Okay, we're going to see it now. I had something to eat before leaving. If I ask you to provide a syntactic analysis for this, it will look like this. Okay, I'm going to provide a syntactic analysis. I had something to eat before leaving. So who, I, what, had what, something to eat before, something to eat, I think is this way, before leaving. Before leaving, I had something to eat. Yes, this is a prepositional phrase adverbial. This is a noun phrase subject, a verb phrase verb, something to eat. This is a noun phrase. I will had what, something to eat. This is an object, right? I is my pronoun head. Had is my verb head. Something is, I would say, a noun head. And to eat is a clause. How do I know that? I know it's a clause because to eat is a verb, right? But what type of clause? This is a to infinitive clause acting as a something to eat, as a complement. And inside of that, we have a verb phrase verb to eat, parenthesis. And inside of that verb phrase verb, I have one single verb, to eat. Before leaving is a preposition head, and leaving, I think, is another clause. What's the name for this clause? Is an ing non-finite or non-finite ing clause with a verb phrase verb, leaving, and inside of that I have a verb head, leaving. You can see two things. The first thing is this: non-finite clauses, they don't have tense, and they are relative clauses. They are subordinate clauses. Therefore, they work in the same way as all those other clauses we reviewed during the term, during this whole semester. Okay, they can be adverbials, they can be complements, they can be post modifiers, they can be objects. Okay, and they receive their names because of the form of the verb phrase. To eat, as it is a to infinitive, will create a to infinitive clause. Leaving, as it is an ing, it will create an ing clause, right? An ing clause. I must tell you the truth. In some other grammars, they add further information to those names, okay? For example, they will state that the ing clause, its real name is non-finite ing clause, okay? Non-finite ing clause. The true infinitive is always non-finite, so they won't say non-finite, right? How many non-finite clauses are there? Well, basically 4. You have the true infinitive clause, the ing clause, the ed clause, and finally, the bare infinitive clause. Those are the names all over again. Non-finite clauses are those clauses where the verb phrase doesn't have tense, right? Non-finite clauses, no tense. Then the name for those clauses will depend on the form of those verb phrases. For example, to eat will create a to infinitive clause. Living will create an ing clause. Played will create an ed clause, and run will create a bare infinitive clause. Okay. ¿Dudas?
Profe, sí, yo tengo una. ¿A qué se refiere con bare infinitive clause?
Sí. Los verbos tienen formas. ¿Sí? Los verbos tienen formas. Si son tensed, tienen la forma present o past, ¿sí? Pero si son tenseless, non-finite, tenseless, pueden ser to infinitive, pueden ser bare infinitive, o sea, igual que un to, pero sin el to. Pueden ser present participle, o sea, ing, or they can be past participle. O sea, con forma ed. Esas son todas las formas que tiene un verbo. O sea, el verbo play, si es tense, played es tense, pero puede ser to play, puede ser play, puede ser playing y puede ser played. Dependiendo de cómo se use. Para que ocupar este que es raro, play solo, es porque adelante va un modal. Así como will play. Ese play de aquí es un bare infinitive. Y este ed de acá abajo, este, es el que se ocupa en los perfectos. Y ese no es un ed1, es un ed2. ¿Queda claro? Más o menos, por lo menos.
Sí, ahora sí, porque no entendía de dónde había sacado esas contracciones, como que andaba medio perdida.
Esto lo vimos.
Profe,
Dígame.
es que se me fue el internet y no alcancé a cachar mucho.
¿Dónde? ¿Dónde quedó?
En el to it, to infinitive clause,
Ah, ya. Simple.
pero
Mira, las cláusulas non-finite, las que no tienen tense, reciben nombres. 4 nombres. Esos nombres dependen de cómo se escribe el verbo. Si el verbo va con to, es un to infinitive, como to eat. Si el verbo va con ing, se escribe, es una ing clause. Si el verbo va con ed, es una ED clause. Y en algunos casos muy raros, muy raros, muy raros, el verbo va en su forma base. Y esas se llaman bare infinitive. Eso. Después, al ladito,
Ya.
al ladito aquí, esto yo lo vi con los chiquillos de los otros dos cursos en el primer semestre. Los verbos tienen formas. El mismo verbo tiene diferentes formas. Si el verbo es tensed, o sea, si tiene tense, puede ser presente o pasado. Play, played. Pero si no tiene tense, puede tener 4 formas, que son las que te acabo de decir. True infinitive, bare infinitive, con ing o con ed. La con ing se llama present participle y la con ed se llama past participle.
Profe, disculpe, tengo una duda.
Ujú,
Que aquí en played,
ujú.
puso I have played y le puso E de 2 y arriba, al lado de play, puso played y le puso E de 1.
Sí, porque este sería un ed1. ¿Por qué? Porque esto es presente, es pasado simple, ¿cierto? I played, pasado simple. I have played, no es pasado simple. ¿Cuál es? Es presente perfecto. ¿Sí? Se escriben igual, played, played, pero en perfecto es un ed2. Profe, pero ¿por qué hacen esa diferencia? Simple, porque played, play es un verbo regular, pero ustedes conocen los irregulares, ¿cierto?
Sí, profe.
Sí, profe.
¿Me nombra alguno que tenga las 3 formas diferentes? Que sea en presente de una forma, en pasado simple de una forma y que el otro sea de otra forma.
Drink, drunk, drunk.
Exacto, muy bien. Drunk, aquí está con el ed1 y se escribe drunk, pero I have drunk es ed2. Y es por eso que existe el ed2, porque hay verbos irregulares que nos muestran que en verdad no tienen la misma forma. ¿Qué significa que no tienen la misma forma? Significa entonces que hay una inflexión de un morfema adentro de ellos. ¿Cachai? Played aquí se ve igual, pero son un ed1 y un ed2. Solo que played es regular nomás. ¿Sí? Pero en la raíz del lenguaje, en verdad no son iguales. Y no se ocupan de la misma forma. Eso. ¿Más
Profe,
dudas? Dígame.
en español, ¿cómo sería, cómo se diría la frase I played? Como en español, como una diferencia para saber cuándo es el perfecto y cuándo es el
Es
como
que
que
nuestro,
no,
es que
no lo
nuestro,
encuentre.
nuestro idioma es más rico, po, es más complejo. Tú hablas un idioma mucho más complejo, o sea, complejo en términos de las posibilidades, ¿no? Porque nosotros tenemos inflexiones para cada uno de los tiempos verbales. Yo juego, yo jugué, yo jugaré, ¿cachai? Entonces, jugar, el verbo jugar, se conjuga en 3 formas diferentes. O sea, el verbo jugar en español recibe una inflexión de un morfema para poder representar el tiempo de forma más concreta. Entonces, nuestros participlos terminan en yo he jugado, yo he tomado, ¿cachai? Tomado, esa forma la puedo ocupar en algún otro tiempo
No,
continuo. Yo estaba tomando, no, pues no se repite.
tomando. No, pues,
No se repite nunca. ¿Cachai que es más complejo el español? Los
sí,
gringos
sí, ya
solo ven,
pasamos eso.
los gringos solo ven dos tiempos. Es brígido, brígido, brígido. Solo ven en su concepción de mundo hay dos tiempos. Lo que ya pasó y lo que está pasando ahora. Nosotros tenemos una comprensión del tiempo mucho mayor. Mucho, mucho, mucho mayor, mucho mayor, mucho mayor. Es brígido, es cuático eso. Eso. Entonces, claro, por la traducción siempre va a ser pobre desde el inglés al español en términos de tiempo.
Profe, pero con lo que preguntó la compañera, igual puede fijarse en el have o el has, po, porque cuando es presente perfecto se ocupa el have o el has.
Ah, claro, ya, pero ahí tiene que hablar entonces que tenemos que saber cuáles son los tiempos del inglés, po, ¿cachai? Que está mal dicho, a mí no me gusta decirlo así porque no es así, po. No son tiempos verbales, está mal dicho eso, ¿cachai? Son las combinatorias posibles en las variaciones de la frase verbal. Eso no se lo voy a explicar a un cabro chico quinto básico, así que le voy a inventar la palabra tiempo verbal, ¿cierto? Eh, están los presentes simple, presente continuo, presente perfecto, ¿sí? Hay play, presente simple, continuo, perfecto, pasado, simple, continuo, perfecto. Y estamos listos. Eso es todo. En español está el presente, presente continuo, presente perfecto, presente pluscuamperfecto, pretérito, perfecto, imperfecto, pretérito continuo. Oye, y así hasta el infinito, pues son chorrocientos mil.
Ya, pero viéndolo así, solamente me tengo que fijar en el have o had para saber un poco, así acercándose si es que es perfecto o continuo.
Lo continuo, lo continuo, recuerda el nombre, es presente, continuous, pero en verdad se llama present tense. Tienes que buscar el tense. ¿Dónde está el tense en el continuo? Ahí, en el am. ¿Cómo sé que eso esté el tense ahí? Porque eso es lo que hace que esté en presente, po. Si yo lo cambio por was, está en pasado. Ahí está el tense. ¿Dónde dice que es continuo? Aquí, po, en el ing. Eso lo hace continuo. Perfecto. Es la combinatoria. Es el verbo have más otro verbo nd2. Eso lo hace perfecto. Esta es una combinación. Pero ¿qué lo hace presente? Have está en presente, po, y had está en pasado. Entonces este es presente perfecto por la combinación y pasado perfecto por la combinación. No sé si que le queda claro.
Sí, profe, mejor.
Eso. Pasó una horita. Tomémonos un break. Voy a hacer un cafecito. Volvemos en 15, ¿ya? 20:15, no, 21:15 volvemos. Regresamos. Estamos hablando de las non-finite clauses, cláusulas entonces cuya verb phrase no tiene tense, son non-finite. Y aquí tenemos ejemplos de ellas. I had something to eat before leaving. To eat es una non-finite. After having spent 6 hours at the hospital, they eventually came home. And this is important. Okay, the idea is that you can identify them and provide an analysis. And as you can see, just like all the other clauses we were reviewing, after having spent 6 hours at the hospital, they eventually came home. Here we have a complex sentence, subject. I would say eventually is alone, came where, came home. And then after having spent 6 hours at the hospital, this whole stuff is a clause, is a dependent clause. How do I know that? Well, because after is a subordinate conjunction. Okay, what type of clause is this? Well, we have to take a look at the verb phrase, having spent what 6 hours where at the hospital. The hospital. I know they is a noun phrase subject, and this is the, as always, right? An adverb phrase, adverbial, a verb phrase verb, and the noun phrase object. But this one is an ing clause acting as an adverbial. I can take it and place it at the very end. They eventually came home after having spent 6 hours at the hospital. In the analysis then, after is a subordinate conjunction. Having spent is a verb phrase verb. Having spent, spent, always the last verb is the main verb, the verb head. And having is my auxiliary verb premodifier. Having spent what? 6 hours, right? Noun phrase object, 6 hours. Determiner premodifier 6 and noun head hours. And then where? At the hospital. Prepositional phrase adverbial with the preposition head and the noun phrase complement the hospital, determiner premodifier and noun head. All the rest is quite simple. I won't do it because you already know how to do it, right? With this, I'm telling you that a non-finite clause is a subordinate clause, a dependent clause. Therefore, it can be placed in every single place that you can put one of those, right? In this case, as an adverbial. Let's take a look at the other one. This is long. Helped by local volunteers, staff at the museum have spent many years sorting and cataloging more than 100,000 photographs. Here, what you can see is the presence of this non-finite clause acting as an adverbial, right? This is a different type of clause because it is an ED clause. How do I know it's an ED clause? Because the verb has an ED form, right? Helped. And it works in the same way as the other one, right? Okay, well, this is a clause, square brackets. Here we have the verb phrase verb and the prepositional phrase object. He left the party and went home, not having anyone to talk to. We're going to do this. He left what? The party and went home, And here we have our non-finite clause, right? He is my noun phrase, subject, verb phrase, verb, noun phrase, object, coordinating conjunction, verb phrase, verb, noun phrase, object, right? And here we have not having anyone to talk to. This is an ing clause acting as an adverbial. Why ing? Because having is the verb, right? Anyone. And here we have another one, to talk to. Right? To talk. And a stranded preposition. That's something we haven't seen so far. In the analysis then, this is a pronoun head, verb head, determiner, pre-modifier, noun head, verb head, noun head, not having, verb phrase, verb. Please be very careful. Non-finite verb phrases, they can be positive, they can be negative, they can be questions, and they work in the same way as the others. Not having is the verb phrase, and not is inside of that verb phrase. Why? Because it is the negative particle for the main verb having. As this is a non-finite verb phrase, you don't have an auxiliary verb, right? Therefore, not is on its own. And that's it, right? So not having is two things: a negative particle, please be careful with this, not is a negative particle, and having is the verb head. And then you can do the rest, right? I'm just going to add the noun phrase, object. Anyone is a pronoun, to talk to, and this is another non-finite clause. It begins with to talk, that's the verb phrase. Therefore, its name is to infinitive clause. Not having anyone to do this is an object as well. Indirect, direct object. Why indirect? The first one, because it's a person. And the other one is the direct receiver of the action, right? Not having, to talk to anyone. Talk to anyone. With the verb phrase, verb, to talk. And then there's a stranded preposition. I won't say much about that because we haven't discussed that yet. Interesting sentence because of the presence of two different non-finite verb phrases. And the very first one of them, not having, is a negative verb phrase. Just like I am not playing, but as this is non-finite, you don't have the auxiliary verb, right? Therefore, you just have the negative particle. Interesting. The person to ask about going to New Zealand is Beck. The person to ask about going to New Zealand is Beck. It's quite difficult as well. Also very interesting. This is more real life-like English than the rest of the things we have done so far. Okay, I have a very big subject, I think. The person to ask about going to New Zealand is Beck. She is Beck, right? So the whole thing is a noun phrase, the whole stuff. She is Beck. This is a noun phrase, subject. This is a verb phrase, verb. And this is a noun phrase, object. Quite simple. Noun head, verb head. Determiner, pre-modifier, the, person, noun head. And here we have our non-finite clause. To ask about going to New Zealand. To ask about going to New Zealand. This is a prepositional phrase. And inside of that prepositional phrase, you have the other non-finite clause. Be careful, because inside of prepositional phrases, I always told you you're going to find noun phrases as complements, but now I'm telling you that you can also find non-finite clauses, right? So careful. And please remember that whenever you write down a preposition, and then if you have a verb, that verb can be written in ing or in ed. Therefore, you can have a non-finite clause as a prepositional complement. Going to, where? New Zealand. So this whole stuff is to ask about going to New Zealand. Is a true infinitive clause acting as the person as a complement. I can't erase it. Inside of that, I have the verb phrase verb to ask, and then a prepositional phrase to ask what about going to New Zealand is an object. The preposition head about, and then next to that, going to New Zealand, going, ing is an ing clause, complement. And inside of that, I have the verb phrase verb going to. Going to is one single verb, verb head. Where? New Zealand, right? This is a noun phrase object. New Zealand is one single lexeme, noun head. In these two different examples, you can see how the to infinitive clause, right? The ing clause, in this case, the ing clause is an adverbial, and the to infinitive clause is a direct object, right? The ing clause is part of the valency pattern on top of it. And then you have to infinitive as part of the ing clause. So you can have a non-finite clause inside of another one. In the second example, you can see how the to infinitive clause is inside of a noun phrase, right? Therefore, acting as a modifier in this case is a complement. Okay, be careful with that. You have to look at the picture really carefully in order to see all the detail. I'm not going to do it, but you can see how you have to look at the picture, how, really carefully. Why? In order to is a preposition. Is a preposition. In order to, the three words is one preposition. In order to see, I would say see is the beginning of the, yeah, I would say that's the beginning. See all the detail, right? If you want to, you can also do this in another way and say, you know what, I believe to see is the verb phrase, therefore it might begin over here. What's important is that you can actually divide that clause into its components, right? Non-finite clauses, words after although, though, and if. We often use non-finite clauses after some subordinating conjunctions. We know them, like after, although, though, and if. For example, by the end of the day, although exhausted, Mark did not feel quite as tired as he had in the past, right? We're talking about this. We're talking about the presence of the subordinating conjunction although, and then what you have is a dependent clause made out of one single verb phrase, exhausted. Okay. This is a, therefore, although exhausted, this is a dependent clause. By the end, although exhausted, I can move it. This is an adverbial clause, acting as an adverbial. And inside of that, you have the verb phrase, verb, and all the and inside of that, you have the ing clause. Relative clauses. A relative clause can be non-finite when the subject of the relative clause is the same as the subject of the main clause. A relative clause can be non-finite, okay, relative clauses, when the subject of the relative clause is the same as the subject of the main clause. The man sitting on the sofa over there is Simon's brother. The man who is sitting. Interesting. We're going to do it. They say, and I'm going to put it all over it another time. who is, okay, the first one, the man who is sitting on the sofa over there is Simon's brother. I'm going to do the analysis for that. The man who's sitting over the sofa, on the sofa over there, is Simon's brother. He is Simon's brother, right? So what we have in here is a noun phrase subject. Determiner, pre-modifier, noun head, who is sitting on the sofa over there. We know this is a relative clause, also called adjectival clause. You know it as an adjectival clause. I don't like that name, but whatever. The man is, I think, is a post modifier because I can erase it. Who is sitting on the sofa over there? The sofa there. Okay, I have who, noun phrase subject, pronoun head, is sitting, verb phrase verb, is sitting, auxiliary verb, pre-modifier, verb head, where, on the sofa, prepositional phrase, right? Adverbial of place, prepositional phrase, just normal, noun phrase complement, the sofa, where, over there, is another prepositional phrase, adverbial of place, with a preposition head, over, and the noun phrase complement, noun head, there. There might be also, there, it can also be a pronoun. I think it's a pronoun because it's replacing the name of an entire place. So I'm gonna write it down as a pronoun. I prefer. Pronoun. Is, right? Verb phrase, verb. Why on top? Well, because that's the main valency pattern. Is who? Simon's brother. That's another noun phrase. And this is an object, right? I won't do that. Okay, in this case, we are seeing a relative clause. And in previous lessons, because of the PowerPoint, we call it adjectival clause. I don't like the name adjectival clause because it's not scientific enough, I would say, but in some other, because in some other places they don't use it. They say, okay, these are relative clauses, okay? Let's take a look at the non-finite form. The important thing is this. As you can see, who is sitting on the sofa over there has a subject, has a verb phrase, and then some other stuff, right? Now, they say that when you are using a relative clause and the subject is the same subject that has been previously stated, you can reduce the relative clause and turn it into a non-finite clause. Like in the second example, the man sitting on the sofa over there is Simon's brother. And it's the same sentence, but as the subject for the non-finite clause is the same, we're going to erase it, right? Therefore, we will have a change, and the change is the presence of a non-finite clause. This is a noun phrase subject. I'm going to change colors for this. This is a noun phrase subject, a verb phrase verb, a noun phrase object, just like in the previous one. Determiner, pre-modifier, noun head, and here we have our ing clause acting as a post modifier, just like in the other one, just like in this place. Sitting is a verb phrase verb, verb head, on the sofa, just like before. over there, just like before. Yeah, and what we have in here is the presence of the presence of a non-finite ing clause acting as an adjectival clause. But I don't like that name. It's a in some other grammars they call it ing relative clause. ing relative clause. And this is what I need you to do in your coming exercise, this type of analysis. Participles in non-finite relative clauses. Okay, I added this information because I think it's important that you know it. The thing is this, there's a word called participle, really, really famous all around grammar. A participle is a verb which can be both ing or ed, and it can be used at least in two different forms. You can use them as adjectives or you can use them as verbs, right? The present participle, the ing, in a non-finite relative clause can occur if the preceding noun is the subject of the participle. We know that we already saw that example. Present participle clauses correspond to finite relative clauses in the active voice. Okay, let's forget about that. Who is the girl sitting next to you in class, right? Who is the girl sitting next to you in class is the same as if I say, who is the girl that sits next to you in class? And as you can see, there is a difference, right? The difference is that as we're talking about the same girl, I can erase the subordinating conjunction that, I can erase that. And because of that, I need to rewrite the verb sits and change it into a non-finite verb, right? And that's it. Bill, waiting outside in the rain, was getting more and more annoyed, right? Bill, who was waiting outside in the rain, right? Because that who is referring to Bill, I can erase it. Therefore, I can reshape the verb phrase was waiting, which is tensed, into a non-finite verb phrase. How can I do it? Erasing the idea of tense, which is the verb was. The past participle in a non-finite relative clause can occur if the preceding noun is the object of the participle. Past participle clauses correspond to finite relative clauses. It's the same idea. In the passive voice, Martina was the only one not informed about the room change. Martina was the only one who was not informed, who had not been informed about the room change. It works in the same way. It works in the very same manner. I won't say much about that. Ok. Lo que necesito que hagan entonces, tengo 5 oraciones. Having learned his lesson, walking along the street, leaving the forest, not knowing my way, being paralytic. Y lo que necesito es que entreguen un análisis sintáctico de cada una de ellas. Esta es la dificultad del ejercicio 2. ¿Queda claro lo que deben hacer?
Sí, profe.
Perfecto, los dejo chiquillos. Tómense 21 a 40, 20 minutos. Nos juntamos a las 22 y revisamos esos análisis y eso es lo que tiene que hacer en el ejercicio 2. ¿Ya? Eso, nos juntamos a las 22. Regresamos. Vamos a hacer los análisis de esto, que es lo que necesito que quede listo para la realización del ejercicio 2. Que es exactamente igual a lo que hemos hecho antes. Having learned his lesson, he went out to play cricket. Having learned his lesson is clearly a dependent clause, but not an independent clause. Having learned, that's the verb phrase. It's an ing clause, acting as an adverbial, right? Having learned what? His lessons. He went out to do what? To play cricket. And here we have another non-finite clause. To play what? Cricket. Having learned, verb phrase verb, quite simple. Auxiliary verb, premodifier, verb head. What? His lesson, noun phrase object. His lesson. He went out to play cricket, went out to do this, right? So it's an action. What went out to what? To play cricket, right? So this is a to infinitive clause acting as an object. Then the common analysis went out, one single verb. And here we have the verb phrase verb, verb head, cricket, noun phrase object, noun head. That's it. Second, the same idea. Walking along the street one day, I saw a dead cobra. Doesn't make any sense, but whatever. Walking the street one day, it's the same idea, ing clause adverbial, walking along the street. That's a prepositional phrase. One day, that's a noun phrase. The street. I saw a dead cobra. Noun phrase subject, verb phrase verb, noun phrase object, walking, verb phrase verb, verb head, along the street, prepositional phrase, walking, where, along the street, adverbial. Preposition head, noun phrase complement, determiner pre-modifier, and noun head. No, I made a mistake. I made another mistake. Okay, one day, adverbial, determiner, pre-modifier, noun head. I saw a dead cobra. And that's it. Number 3, the same idea. Leaving the forest. Do you know what? Aquí le falta una coma. Eso, la reconoció, ¿vieron? ¿Por qué le falta la coma? Porque es una dependent clause adverbial que está adelante. Lo vimos. Leaving the forest, we advanced into the open plain. The open plain, ing, leaving the forest. Verb phrase verb, verb head. Y si se dan cuenta, chiquillos, es exactamente lo mismo que estábamos haciendo atrás, solo que lo dimos una vuelta pudiendo explicar qué rayos es una non-finite. Leaving what? The forest. We advance where? Into. Creo que es un adverbio del lugar, ¿no? Pronoun head, verb head, preposition, home phrase complement, the open plane. Open plane. Todo es igual que los análisis anteriores. No hay nada nuevo. Not knowing my way, I asked a policeman. Lo mismo. Not knowing my way. Not knowing. Ya lo dijimos cómo se hacía. I asked a policeman. Knowing, ing. Entonces, ing, close adverbial. Verb phrase, verb. Dos cosas. Not, negative. Particle. Knowing what, my way, way, I asked a policeman, I asked a policeman. Y la última es también igual, ¿no? Being paralytic, he could not walk. Ing, clause adverbial, noun phrase, subject, verb phrase, verb. Being what? Paralytic. Verb phrase, verb head, paralytic. ¿Es un adjetivo? ¿Eso no? Parece que sí.
Sí,
Y si
profe, lo
es,
busqué.
y si es un adjetivo, es un complement. Adjective head, he, pronoun head, could not walk. Could, auxiliary verb. Not es una negative particle. Walk, verb head. Y eso es todo lo que necesito que haga en la cátedra. En el ejercicio 2. ¿Alguna duda de lo que hice?
La verdad es que no, porque como ya es como el mismo proceso, solo que le sumo ahora digo, la ing clause y el tema de la negative particles y como que se le sumó nomás como a lo que hacemos siempre dentro del análisis.
Rodrigo, es solo cambiarle el nombre, es exactamente lo mismo, pero si es que la cláusula dependiente es non-finite, le tienes que poner estos nombres nuevos. ING o true infinitive o una de esas. ¿Ya? Les pido entonces para terminar. 1. Les subo el video, les mando los materiales, todo eso. 2. La próxima semana, estúdielo ya. La próxima semana les voy a entregar un set de oraciones para poder analizar. Entonces, les entrego eso. La próxima clase es así. Les entrego esto, usted lo realiza, nos vamos a juntar tarde, 9:30. Revisamos lo que hace, las dudas que tenga y estamos listos para el ejercicio. ¿Ya? Así que eso. Que todos tengan una linda semana. Cuídense mucho. Les subo esto en cuanto se rendere. Que estén bien. Nos vemos el lunes.
Profe,
Dígame.
el Power lo va a mandar por correo.
Sí, pues por supuesto que sí.
Ya, muchas gracias.
Chao, que estén muy bien.
Descanse. Chau.
Chau, chau.